Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mobashra Tazamal. I'm the Associate Director of The.Bridge.Initiative, a research project on Islamophobia at Georgetown University. Our guest today is Faisal Hanif, media analyst at the Center for Media Monitoring in the UK. We're going to have a very crucial and timely conversation about a new report that exposes the systemic bias in how the media, particularly Western media outlets, cover Israel's war on Gaza. For nearly 2 years, Israel's assault on Gaza, described by leading human rights organizations and UN experts as a genocide, has involved relentless bombing, forced starvation, the destruction of every university in the Strip, the near total collapse of the healthcare system, and so much more. Israel's violence in Gaza has produced the highest number of child amputees in the world and has become the deadliest conflict for journalists in modern history. At least 62,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 17,500 children. And because civil society has been decimated and tens of thousands remain under the rubble, some academic estimates suggest the real death toll could be in the hundreds of thousands. But if you're relying on Western media, much of this information is minimized or missing altogether. Since the war began on October 7th, 2023, following Hamas's attack on Israel, Western media coverage has consistently shown a troubling pattern of bias, downplaying Palestinian suffering while centering Israeli narratives. A new report from the Center for Media Monitoring, titled BBC on Gaza, Israel, One Story, Double Standards, offers hard data to back this up. The report analyzed over 35,000 pieces of BBC content and found a clear trend. Palestinian voices and pain were routinely sidelined, while Israeli perspectives were given emotional depth and prominence. Faisal Hanif is one of the contributors to the report, and he'll walk us through the findings and help us understand how the BBC's coverage reflects and reinforces Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. Faisal, thank you for joining us, and let's jump right into the report. My first question is, one of the conclusions drawn in the report is that the evidence clearly suggests that within the BBC's editorial framework, Palestinian lives simply do not matter equally. Can you summarize some of the evidence that you collected in your analysis that led you to make this conclusion?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the kind introduction, Mubashra. So I think our findings in themselves reiterate that point that the Palestinian lives don't really matter equally in the BBC coverage. So if I go through some of the findings, your listeners will get an idea of exactly what we're talking about and why you can make that claim. So we look at, for example, what we call coverage disparity. If you look at some of the conservative estimates, the death toll ratio of Palestinians to Israelis is 34-1. So 34 Palestinians killed for every one Israeli. I think the figures that we give in the report are 42,010 versus 1,246 Israelis killed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, BBC content actually mentions Israeli deaths up to 33 times more per fatality.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of broadcasts, i.e., on radio and television, that figure is 19 times more. So even though you've got this huge disparity in terms of numbers of deaths, the focus in terms of articles, broadcast pieces, and just the humanization of those who have been killed seems to heavily focus on the Israelis. I mean, it's actually quite startling, 33 times to 1, despite there being 42,000 against 1,200 or just more than that. So that's one of the findings. We look at, for example, the language that's used behind this. So when we analyzed language that was applied to Palestinian victims and the language that was applied to Israeli victims, and we look at terms like the word murder, a term that describes a very deliberate act. It appeared 220 times in relation to Israeli deaths, i.e. they were murdered by Hamas or they were murdered by Palestinians, etc. And only once for Palestinian deaths. We only see it applied one time to describe the death of Palestinians. Equally, words like butchered or butcher were applied exclusively to Israelis. There was no mention of that term when it applied to Palestinians. And this is not just, for example, so there, there's two things here. One is that you have guests who come on and repeat these terms, especially pro-Israel guests or Israeli ministers, who will use this emotive language to describe how, you know, Hamas butchered our citizens or murdered our citizens. But we found that the journalists themselves are using these terms in a very disparate way, where the terms were applied far more in far greater numbers to the Israelis as opposed to the Palestinians. So when even the journalists are commenting on this and making their observations or reading off scripts, the language is very different when it's applied to both sets of victims. You look at things like the interview imbalance between, you know, featuring Israeli voices against those who would be deemed as pro-Palestinian. So if you look at figures there, we found 2,350 Israeli guests versus 1,085 pro-Palestinian guests across the BBC platforms. So Israeli, and tied into that, Israeli perspectives were broadcast 11 times more frequently than Palestinian ones. Again, a clear disparity, despite the fact that after the first month, where you can sort of understand the coverage may have been focused on what happened on October the 7th, and then the ongoing killing of Palestinians in Gaza and then the West Bank, etc. Even despite that, it's, you know, Israeli guests and perspectives were far more frequently platformed on the BBC. And then you look at things like, sort of, again, going back to the language, terms like, you know, what we call passive language. So when they're reporting on Palestinian casualties, the language is very passive. It kind of obscures the Israeli responsibility. We've all seen, if you go on social media, we've all seen examples of sort of headlines where the Israelis are sort of omitted. You don't get a mention of who's actually killed this individual or who's actually killed these groups of people. It's just, you know, Palestinians almost die by some invisible force. Whereas Israeli suffering was described with a sort of active agency and with humanizing detail. So, I mean, those are some of the findings. There's others as well in the report, but just I think that gives quite a clear picture of just how one-sided a lot of this reporting is on the, or definitely what we found the reporting has been on BBC platforms.
Those figures are just so stark. And so I think a lot of us who have been observing this since the violence broke out on October 7th and Israel's large-scale bombardment of the Strip, we've watched and we've observed on social media, we've looked at the news headlines, and we've seen the disparity in coverage. I mean, also one of the things to note is that Israel doesn't allow foreign journalists into Gaza. So that immediately, you know, silences Palestinian voices on the ground. And I think you mentioned this, your report talks about this, about how Israeli commentators or individuals from the Israeli government are given space on BBC platforms to speak. One of the things, you know, for those of us who study Islamophobia in the media is that many experts have noted Muslims are often talked about but rarely heard from, meaning that, you know, diverse Muslim voices are rarely given a platform or given space to present their own views. And then you found in this study that Palestinian perspectives face significant barriers to being heard on BBC platforms. Can you expand on this for our audience and outlining what these barriers are and how they're impacting reporting?
Yeah, so I mean, if you go back to the statistics, so just to remind your listeners, I mean, Palestinian voices appeared half as often as Israelis. So 1,085 Palestinian guests or pro-Palestinian guests versus 2,350 Israeli guests. And what that does, I think, it creates a clear sort of disparity between what kind of viewpoints are allowed to be platformed or given prominence throughout the coverage as a whole and on a sort of daily basis. You have, for example, limited diversity. So most of the Palestinian figures that were interviewed were civilians with fewer sort of official experts who could give maybe greater context to the whole situation and what the Palestinians have faced before October the 7th and what they've been facing since October the 7th. Unlike the Israelis, where most of them happen to be politicians or representatives or ex-government figures or analysts who come on and repeat the same old tired lines and the propaganda, and everything refers back to Hamas and human shields and all this. It's almost like a script being read and repeated time and time and time again. I mentioned the contextual omission. So to give you another figure, just 0.5% of the coverage referenced the Israeli occupation, and fewer than 1% mentioned key themes like settlements or blockades. And they rarely, if ever, provided any deeper explanation to these things. You cannot understand even what happened on October the 7th or beyond without explaining the context behind all of this. There is a larger context to the whole Israel-Palestinian dispute. And the fact that, Israeli occupation is not some kind of opinion or viewpoint. This is internationally recognized by almost every country in the world, by outside agencies like the UN and others. It's very clearly, I don't think anybody can really argue with the fact that this is an occupation. So why is it not framed in such a way? Because that is the reality. Why is it constantly omitted or not even mentioned? 0.5% of the coverage references an occupation. That effectively leaves it, what that does in effect is it sort of turns the Palestinians into sort of irrational actors. Well, why are they doing all of this? Why is there a fight over any of this? If you're not going to mention the fact that they're occupied, you effectively remove the agency from anything that they're doing or they're able to do. And another thing on top of that is what we found to be the suppression of genocide discourse. So whenever it's quite clear now, I think outside agencies, foreign nations, experts, lawyers, everybody is looking at what's happening. But even ex-Israeli military personnel have admitted that actually what's taking place in Gaza and what has taken place is akin to a genocide or is genocide. And when the Palestinians are bringing this up and on BBC news channels and saying, our people in Gaza and in the West Bank are facing a genocide or currently facing a genocide, we found that BBC presenters were either interrupting them or just dismissed the claims. We found 100 examples of where claims of genocide were just dismissed, or the presenter actually spoke down to the guest, and I think on one occasion actually said to a guest, "Genocide is not what's happening here." Why are the presenters themselves making this? Why are they making this observation or conclusion? Why are they making this conclusion? On what basis? That you have almost every agency giving you figures of tens of thousands dead, which by the way are probably underestimates. What some research has shown that these figures are very conservative. But at the same time, when the Israeli leaders talk about genocide taking place on October 7th, that was never challenged. We hear Israeli leaders and also some of the statements that have been made by Israeli leaders. You had the Prime Minister of Israel come up with biblical references to Amalek, and you heard the Israeli Prime Minister and the head of the military were are wanted for war crimes now because of some of the statements they made. You had Israeli ministers come on the BBC on some of the current affairs programs and even in the news programs, and they openly described Palestinians as animals, as human animals, really dehumanizing language. And yet there was no real challenge to any of that. So you see this sort of disparity, and you can look at it and you can talk about the social impact to all of this as well. If you systematically sideline and diminish the voice of Palestinians, you effectively dehumanize their experiences. It heightens the misconceptions around them, And you mentioned the word Islamophobia, and a lot of our work at the Center of Media Monitoring is looking at the representation of Muslims in the media. And there is a certain Islamophobic attitude around framing Palestinians as passive or sort of peripheral in all of this. It's almost as their voices don't really count in this. They are the sort of uncouth, barbaric, which is a word, again, when you come to the language, it's a word that is used to describe the actions against Israeli victims. So quite, and the what the Israelis to an extent have been successful at doing, and Israeli representatives, is framing this whole Palestinian struggle as one of it's one of as a civilizational issue between the enlightened West and the barbaric East. And you've had Palestinians compared to ISIS. You've had Hamas compared to ISIS. And whatever Hamas and their evils may be, anybody of any intelligence knows that Hamas and ISIS are not the same thing. They're just not. Let's not. But the Israelis have been very determined to make that point, and have been allowed to make that point on screen, to almost frame and manufacture this whole thing as one of, oh look, we're doing the work of the West here. We're fighting radical Islam, and we're fighting these guys who also want to murder you guys in the West. There's that framing, and that hasn't really been sufficiently challenged.
Yeah. I think one of the things, hearing your response to the question is that there's no context provided whenever this issue is addressed on the BBC, but also there's an unwillingness to even question, Israeli commentators that are brought on, or Israeli officials that are brought on. There's an unwillingness from presenters to even push back on their claims, in the sense of bringing up reports from the UN, or talking about, well, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have declared that there is a genocide going on. There isn't a willingness to bring these facts up when having these interviews with these pro-Israel voices.
It's not just a case of not challenging the Israeli representatives. What the presenters are doing is, when they're interviewing Palestinian guests, they're using Israeli talking points to challenge or belittle the arguments of the Palestinian guests. There's this we mentioned in the report, there's this constant thing about whenever the Palestinian guests are quoting facts on the ground and what's taken place against the Palestinians, you have this response of, well, Israel says this, well, Israel claims this, well, the Israelis would deny this, well, this Israel spokesman said X, Y, and Z. And it's almost like, and some of the Palestinian guests have pushed back against this. It's like, why are you telling me what Israel says, and why are you reading this script as if, on their behalf almost? So I think what you said is absolutely correct, but I think it goes beyond that. It's as if the whole sort of framing is in favor of how the Israelis would want it to be, which is quite disturbing.
Yeah, I think to that point of they bring this up to Palestinian speakers, who the very few pro-Palestine voices that are brought on, almost as if they seem to be parroting Israeli government's line. But just to note, it's BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. It's a publicly funded news station. It's supposed to be objective, as objective as journalistic standards can be. So that is quite disturbing for a corporation that is publicly funded, that is British Broadcasting Corporation, to be seemingly what appears to be parroting a foreign government's, line, narrative. And I think the other point that you talked about is the rhetoric used when describing Palestinians is very much so the usual tropes that we hear when we talk about Islamophobia. And I do want to note, anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia are not the same, but they do overlap. I do want to note, obviously, there is a Christian community in Palestine, that's also being targeted. But I think it's important for our audience and for our viewers, and CfMM has covered this in many of their other reports about how Muslims and those perceived to be Muslims or Arabs are talked about in the media. And it's the usual tropes of being barbaric and being tie them to terrorism or extremism. We've seen so much. If you go on social media, you see so much content from Israeli settlers or right-wing Israeli organizations or individuals who literally speak about Palestinians, Palestinian children, babies as terrorists, and therefore dehumanizing them, and then therefore justifying killing them. That and we have had Israeli ministers, heads, very high officials there. I think Smotrich and Ben-Gvir openly talk about ethnically cleansing Gaza, and these are the things that you don't hear on the BBC. You don't hear them talking about these very, very dangerous, problematic, dehumanizing narratives that the Israeli government has pushed out. Rather, not only not talk about, but also not challenged if anyone does bring them up. It's almost as if like
Well,
let's not address those things.
I mean, you mentioned Smotrich there and
Mhm.
Ben-Gvir. Um, it's interesting because one of the things the BBC quite quickly did within this whole coverage, I think in the second week of the coverage, when you had the attack on one of the hospitals,
Mm.
and there was this confusion as to who exactly attacked the hospital. Was it
Yeah.
the Israelis? Was it misfire by one of the Palestinian groups? And within that, there seemed to be a decision made within the BBC that they were now going to appropriate anything that came out of Gaza to Hamas. And we suddenly started seeing this use of the Hamas-run health ministry
Yes.
to describe any figures or any claims that were coming um, out of Gaza. And it was strange because in previous conflicts or in previous times when the Israelis have bombarded Gaza, we never saw this. We saw the description of the Gaza Health Ministry, and we found that the Israelis themselves, as well as other outside agencies and news agencies, always trusted, or more or less trusted, the figures that were coming out of that ministry throughout these
Mm.
other conflicts. And yet, for some reason, we now start to see Hamas run health ministry. Now you can say, okay, fine, if the BBC wants to go down that route, then let's apply that thing both ways. When you
Mm.
describe the Israeli government, why are you not contextualizing it as a government of far right, anti-Muslim, um, racist ministers? Because that's what the likes of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are. The argument would go that Netanyahu could be included in that. Netanyahu has had a policy since the 1970s where he's openly declared that he will never allow a Palestinian state. I think that's very relevant context. I think if you're going to start attaching these labels, then surely that works both ways. But we don't see that thing about a far right Israeli government or a government that has sworn never to allow a Palestinian state. We don't see the same thing happening. And again, I mean, going back to the point, it's the disparity and the lack of consistency, which is a major issue with the BBC.
Or that, you're talking about those labels. I mean, Netanyahu and other individuals literally have an ICC arrest warrant out for them. Why is that not used when mentioning these
Absolutely. Yeah.
individuals? So yeah, you brought me into my next question of the use of emotive language and qualifiers. You found that the BBC's use of language appears systematic and varies according to the identity of the victims and perpetrators. And it found that the BBC presented Israeli suffering as inherently more tragic, more deliberate, more worthy of human empathy than Palestinian deaths. Can you just provide us with some of the language used when talking about Israeli victims versus Palestinian victims?
Yeah, I mean, this was interesting. This is one of my personal sort of interests. I'm always interested in how language is used, and it's something I've done in previous reports. So just to give you some basic examples, we mentioned the word murder. So when it's applied to Israeli victims are described as having been murdered 220 times. It's used for Palestinians one time. In their entire coverage, it's used one time for Palestinians and 220 times for Israelis. And that word itself implies an active intent to, to commit a, an action which everybody would deem morally wrong, i.e.,
Mhm.
murder. And then you look at more sort of emotive language, like the word butchered or butcher. Again, a very harsh description and something that's somebody is actively doing in a very um, harsh way. It's used exclusively for Israelis. So the Israelis are described as having been butchered. And we've seen images of Palestinian babies with their heads chopped off and limbs missing. But we never see the use of this word. And by the way, these stats it includes both what the presenters are saying and also what guests might um, say on screen. The word massacre, for example, 18 times we found the use of the word massacre by BBC presenters themselves to describe what happened on October 7th and what's happened against Israeli citizens. And we never see in headlines for Palestinians. Zero mentions. And very rarely in other scripts or beyond headlines do we see the use of the word massacre or description of Palestinians having been massacred. You go down to words like atrocities and slaughter. Slaughter, again, a very deliberate description of a very deliberate act. 4 times more for Israelis and very minimal use of Palestinians. You see the word brutal, again, a very harsh description. Very frequently to describe what happened on October the 7th and against Israelis, and seldom used for Palestinians. And these are some of the words. If your listeners can look at the report, and I'm hoping they will read the report, they'll find other examples of this where it's almost the disparity is very clear. Nobody can really argue with these figures. You ask the question, well, is it unconscious? Is this a deliberate sort of way of writing scripts? And what was interesting is that one of the early letters that went into the BBC aficionados, the people higher up, the senior editors, by the journalists within the BBC who complained about what they saw early on in this whole thing about the disparity in terms of coverage, they brought up the issue of language. They actually mentioned that words like slaughter were being used to describe Israelis, but they weren't being used to describe Palestinians. And they wanted to know why. But we found that this has continued beyond that stage, that even though the BBC's own staff were warning the editors, or not, I mean, warning maybe, we talk about use of language, warning may not be the right word, but notifying the editors that we've seen there's a clear disparity. And they don't seem to have listened, because we found that because our analysis goes over the period of 1 year, and so they don't seem to have listened. And I mean, the stark contrast reveals how BBC framing effectively and systematically, I think, humanizes Israeli suffering while sort of neutralizing Palestinian suffering. And in the report we produce a word cloud to show this, where it's very clear that the real harsh words, or the words that you can give emphasis to on screen as well, but just by and people who are linguists or voice coaches and all those kind of people will probably affirm this, that those kind of words are used to really alarm people or highlight something that's very serious or bad, and those are used to frame Israeli victims in whatever light the BBC want us to do that.
Yeah, I think those words, when you see massacre or you see butchered or you see murdered, it immediately you're alerted to it. You want to read it, you want to see what's going on. If you hear it, you're like, oh my God, what does that mean? So if you're not using the same emotive, powerful language when it comes to the tens of thousands, arguably hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that have been killed by Israel, that makes it so their deaths are not of value or are not newsworthy, that it's passive, that they just died. I think you talked about earlier in the episode, we talked about how the passive voice is used for Palestinians who are killed. And often you'll see in headlines, this isn't just the BBC, I think there's many Western media outlets that have done this as well, where it's 100 Palestinians killed trying to get food at the distribution site. These are the ones that we've been seeing most recently. Not talking about, well, who killed these Palestinians? Why are they at distribution sites? There's a forced starvation campaign happening by Israel, so people have no food. So they're gone to these sites that are being run by Israel and the US, where it becomes just open range for the soldiers to kill as many Palestinians as they'd like, who are starving. So I think one of the big themes that constantly comes up in this conversation is lack of context, lack of just objectivity, lack of information, which is what the news is supposed to be presenting to us, to better inform the audience so they are aware of what's happening. But it seems like when you look at this report, the BBC is not doing that. And I think one way to really, one part of the report that really brings this into very, very kind of obvious terms is you look at the BBC's coverage of Ukraine versus its coverage of Gaza. I wanted to ask you to go into that because I think it highlights that the BBC is capable of presenting, an objective or as objectively possible side to conflicts that are happening. But yeah, if you can present some more information on that.
Yeah, I think it's important to note at the beginning that no two conflicts are ever really the same.
Yeah.
But there are consistent features within war and conflict, and especially in international relations. But what was very clear early on is that on social media, people quite quickly noticed the disparity. You saw these headlines put next to each other, one looking at what's happening in Ukraine with the Russians, and one what's happening in Gaza with the Israelis. And quite quickly, people showed that there was a lack of consistency in how these headlines were being framed or framing the event. So one of the examples being that quite often when the Israelis did something bad or killed Palestinians, the headline didn't mention the Israelis at all. It didn't mention who was doing the killing. Whereas with what's happening in Ukraine, the Russians were very prominent, or Russia was very prominent within the headline. It was very clear to the reader who has done the killing, who is the quote unquote bad guy here. And I think there's three real elements to this. One is what we call framing disparity. So, the BBC speaks about war crimes in Ukraine, 2.6 times more often than what's happening in Gaza. So what's happening in Ukraine for the BBC is quite clearly a war crime. And it may well be. They may well have a justification for why they believe that the Russians have committed war crimes in Ukraine. I'm not denying that. But outside agencies, and we forget the Palestinians for a moment, which the BBC is very good at doing, but outside agencies like the UN, sort of what we might call third-party agencies, and officially the UN, Human Rights Watch, etc., they are telling you, and the ICJ itself, that there are war crimes taking place in Gaza. The images are showing that. BBC has a verified service which can do its own job in investigating that. The fact that journalists are not even allowed in them quite clearly show. I mean, basic journalism school teachers in journalism school will tell you this, that if somebody's not allowing you access to certain information, it's why? Because there's something to hide.
Yeah.
The Israelis are not allowing you to get in. So all of those things put together indicate that there's something going wrong here. But we don't see the same sort of use of the description of war crimes here. There's always some either excuse made, or the whole thing is fudged into it's both sides are fighting, and this both sidism, which basically frames this one militarily advanced occupying force supported by the superpowers of its age against these occupied people who are locked into this, small parcel of land and being bombarded. And yet we see this two-sidism. So in the terms of framing disparity, to go back to it, I mean, Russia was quite clearly framed as the perpetrator, 2.7 times more than Israel was in Gaza. This is in BBC coverage. We see differences in humanization. Ukrainian victims received personal, emotional storytelling and profiling by journalists in terms of their casualties. I mean, 62% of the coverage had some form of this in, whereas only sort of 6% of Gazan journalists who were killed, 6% of their deaths were covered on the BBC. You think, where is the solidarity with the very people who are doing the same job as you? As you're not allowed into Gaza and the Israelis are preventing it, the people who are there, who are on the ground telling you their stories, you're not even prepared to humanize them. Only on 6% of occasions, even though hundreds of journalists have been murdered by Israel. So that's another difference in the another thing that we might call a double standard. And we have the third thing I want to speak about is what we call narrative asymmetry. So Ukraine was depicted as a nation under occupation. Again, it may well be correct. There's a good argument to make on that. But Gaza was largely anchored as a sort of Israel-Hamas war. The historical context, as you mentioned before, is removed. The long-term occupation, there's no mention of it. And, there's these two sides fighting against each other. And this is Israel-Hamas war. And this is just the way it is. The two sides are fighting. And removing all the talk about occupation and what's happened in Gaza before and what's going on in Gaza now, it almost equalizes these two very unequal sides. Again, and the problem with that is it's just inaccurate. If you are going to frame that in that way, you have started on a major falsehood, and the coverage that goes beyond that is going to repeat all of those same falsehoods and omit a lot of the information, and that's where a lot of the disparity sort of lies. Ukraine, I mean, to put it in simple language, Ukraine is effectively the good guy for the BBC. And whereas somebody could equally say, well, Gaza and the Palestinians should fall into that camp as well. But the Gaza and the Palestinians don't fall into that camp. And that's where you see this. And you see on social media, you go on Twitter almost every day, you'll see somebody who will have the difference in how the BBC has framed it, just in its headlines. Yeah. Attacks on Ukraine compared with attacks on Gaza. Yeah, it's very, very clear to us, and the report shows this.
Yeah, and I think what the coverage of Ukraine also demonstrates, the BBC is able to have a sort of, I wouldn't say super objective, but is able to present both sides in a clear manner, and is able to identify, who is doing the bombing and where are the victims and who are the victims. So it's able to do that. And when it comes to Ukraine, why isn't it able to do that when it comes to Gaza? And I think that's what the report really highlights, is that BBC is perfectly capable of doing it. The question here is why won't they do it in Gaza? And I know that the report, CfMM, you did a launch event in Parliament regarding this report, and Richard Burgess, the Director of News Content at the BBC, was in attendance. What has been the BBC's response to the report, if any?
Yeah, as you mentioned, we had a launch event in the British Parliament, very successfully launched it. We had oversubscription of people who wanted to be there. Quite clearly, emotions ran high, and credit to Richard Burgess for actually appearing before what, from his perspective, would be a hostile crowd who were very keen to ask him about the evidence that we'd laid forth in the report. I mean, to give you an official response, a BBC spokesperson effectively welcomed the scrutiny, and it is a report that goes over 180 pages. So I think they need some time to read it. One of the things we tried to ask Richard Burgess towards the end of the event was to give us some pledges as to, because we make recommendations in the report as well, but to give a pledge as to that the BBC will look at the report in seriousness, will circulate it inside the organisation, and will take some action because the evidence is quite clear. They, I think, at the moment are looking over the report. There's been no official sort of response back to us, and so I think at the moment we've laid on the evidence. They are we've been contacted by people within the BBC, anonymously, and other people who work closely with the BBC, who are very, you know, who are, I mean, delighted is not the right word, but who, who welcome our findings and who want to move this conversation forward, because there has been attacks from the other side which claim that the BBC is actually anti-Israeli, which we show is quite clearly not, and the evidence shows is quite clearly not. But they make those claims, and when they've made those claims, and they've been backed up by a rabid right-wing press in Britain, the BBC has responded to them. So we're asking the BBC now that it has the evidence, and now that it's not just people who are coming with anecdotal examples, to please, take this forward, implement some action, and because this stuff is measurable, and we can measure it again and see what changes can be made. In terms of internally within the BBC, over 100 BBC staffers have actually signed letters calling attention to the double standards in Gaza versus Ukraine coverage, and demanded some kind of accountability. Although there's not been no sort of informal sort of internal review that has been announced yet. So it's a waiting game, but hopefully within the coming weeks and months we can get maybe some more events. There's an event at the Frontline Club in Paddington in London, a place that is renowned for having events particularly focused on journalists and to get a lot of people from the media together. One of the speakers on the panel that we have is Ben DePere, who is a former news editor at Channel 4, who now works independently as a filmmaker. And one of the films he's made on Gaza, which has actually been, was due to be shown on the BBC platforms, and they've decided not to do that. And in the last week or so, he's released a statement. So it'll be interesting to see what somebody like him, who was actively on the receiving end of the BBC's decisions when they've been put under pressure from the other side, has to say about that. So this, the pressure is on, the evidence is there, and let's wait and see. I'm sure we can give your listeners an update in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I mean, any updates that we have, we'll sure to present it and share it on our social media platforms, and definitely going to tell our viewers to follow CfMM also on social media platforms as well. Before I close out, I have one last question, and I think this is also very important given everything we've just talked about. And the work that CfMM does, what are the consequences of this biased reporting when it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism in society today? What are the consequences of it? What does it do to our society?
I mean, you can look at it in different ways. So on the street level, as it was on the ground, you go into sort of statistical mode. You can look at the rise in hate crimes. There has been a massive increase in Islamophobia. The pro-Palestinian protests, which have been, London has hosted some of the biggest ones globally, have been vilified heavily in the British media, despite the fact that tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people have actually come out on the streets of London, and thousands of people have come out in other towns and cities in the UK, but they've been heavily vilified. Even when, for example, I think a march of pro-Palestinian people, there was over 100,000 people there, and the arrests were so minimal. They were actually they're found to be less than the average football match in Britain, and yet despite that, you saw the focus on these arrests and how the Palestinian supporters are troublemakers. And there was one occasion early on where the BBC misrepresented them and had to apologize on screen when we made a complaint to them, because they described the protesters as pro-Hamas. So there's this thing about trying to frame them in this way. But going back to the rise in hate crime, I mean, you effectively amplify the framing of Palestinians as aggressors, combined with muting the Palestinian suffering, I think is correlated with significant increase in sort of anti-Muslim incidents, because one thing the Israelis have been very successful at is framing this as a sort of Muslim versus West issue. So it's the Muslims fighting against Western civilization, and we are protecting Western civilization, and that has an impact on street level, especially with the far right and even the rabid right wing. You know, those who you wouldn't necessarily class as the far right, but when it comes to Muslims and Islam, adopt far right or very far right positions. You have the dehumanization aspect, you know, the marginalization of Palestinian voices and the context, and it supports sort of stereotypes of Palestinians as extremists, or people who are faceless, rather than being sort of fellow human beings with rights, uh, in you know rights that are enshrined in international law above anything else. Public misperception and misconception, disproportionate empathy towards Israeli suffering, again reinforcing the harmful view of Palestinians as sort of drivers of extremism, less deserving of sympathy, which effectively fuels sort of anti-Palestinian prejudice in public discourse and policy. I mean, you've seen in the last few days in Britain, Palestinian Action, who happens to be a group that targets, for example, they targeted one of the munition factories, or a factory linked to making planes, which some investigative journalists in Britain have shown have actively supported the Israelis in the bombardment of Gaza, or the surveillance of Gaza. So they've put paint over these planes or whatever they've done, and they've been designated a terrorist organization. So you've seen legislation in terms of at the political level is used to silence Palestinian voices and Palestinian protest, and also the erosion of trust. I mean, if you have such disparate coverage between the two sides, I think it threatens the trust in the BBC's impartiality. What our evidence shows is that the BBC isn't impartial in this. It can't be. If there's such disparity in these figures, it hasn't really stuck to its editorial standards, and I think that has a major effect, because the BBC has a huge impact on the landscape of Britain politically, in terms of the discussions that take place. You had the Israeli president complain to the then British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in the early days of this whole thing, about he pinpointed the BBC ahead of any other media organization in the world, because the BBC wasn't at that time, according to him, following the script or following what the Israelis wanted. So that shows you how important the BBC is on a global level.
Yeah.
And if the trust is eroded in the BBC by the overwhelming number of people who support the Palestinian cause, or who have seen what the Palestinians have gone through, I think that's a major problem. Then where does that leave us in terms of media? And I think also for British Muslims, it's not a good place to be when a major news organization like the BBC, who you've historically trusted to be neutral and to have this middle of the road voice, which gives you a platform to air your grievances and viewpoints, is effectively shown to be so one-sided. It's a very difficult position, because the BBC, the British media landscape is dominated by right-wing press, and increasingly rabid right-wing press, who have quite clearly made Muslims a target. You saw the riots last summer, where mosques were attacked. There's been other incidents. There's a huge emphasis on the whole grooming issue that reared its head about 15 years ago in Britain, but there's a renewed emphasis on trying to push that to demonize, and from the right-wing press's perspective, and right-wing sort of ideologues, is to demonize Muslims, British Pakistanis, all of those who are sort of would be natural supporters, or who have natural sympathies with the Palestinian cause. So it's very problematic.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to reiterate to our listeners to definitely check out the Center for Media Monitoring's report. We'll link it in the description. We'll link it on our social media. Do follow the Center for Media Monitoring on their social media platforms. They do fantastic work when it comes to looking at Islamophobia in the British media. They have multiple reports looking at media bias, and it's always with hard evidence. It's really shocking when you look at some of the stuff that they've come out with, but also shows you that there's so much work to be done in this space. And this conversation and this report is one of those things that's highlighting the Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism that's present in British media, but I would also argue in other Western media outlets as well. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today. For everyone, our listeners, also follow Bridge on our social media platforms and tune in for the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you.